So in today's webinar, we're going to go over the ASP.NET MVC GridView extension. And it's kind of a high-level overview, but I'm going to jump into a couple of scenarios that have been coming up in the forums and in the support issue, namely data binding and adding a custom column like a combo box. And then you will be completely free to ask any questions, because we've also got the ASP.NET team here, the DevExpress ASP.NET Mindshare, that can answer any questions that you might have. So to begin, let's start with the MVC GridView demos. Now, you can get to it from the product page, or you can simply go to demos.devexpress.com and then click on the extensions. I simply type in mvc.devexpress.com and it brings you to the MVC GridView, not just GridView, but all MVC extension demos. If you click on GridView, you'll see several of the demos that we have set up. Now, one thing to make clear about the MVC GridView is that it's very similar in terms of feature set to our WebForms GridView, but without the view state, and it's also very specific to ASP.NET MVC framework, meaning that it's a true MVC extension, so that some people have asked, can they use WebForms and MVC? You wouldn't do that, and this GridView extension is made specifically for ASP.NET MVC. So let's first take a look at a few of these features, because out of the box, most grids, for example, default Microsoft Grid won't let you do some of the things that our MVC GridView extension will. For example, we've given you this demo to show you some of the data binding. Now, one of our ASP.NET devs created this cool little Twitter-based demo that shows you how to bind to data from Twitter. So here we're picking some of the DevExpress evangelists or CTO and so forth that are talking about us on Twitter. And if you wanted to take a look at any of the code behind for this demo, or any of the other demos that you see here, we've separated out a couple of tabs here. So the demo runs here, and if you click on the code tab up at the top right, it will show you all the code behind for this. Now I'm going to just quickly cover a little bit about this. In ASP.NET, by the way, I should mention that I'm assuming you have some knowledge of ASP.NET MVC. So I'm going to start with the basics that you understand what a model is, what a view is. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Should we be seeing something on your screen changing? Because currently all I see is yours. Okay, because it's not. It's frozen on your extra grid. There we go.
Yes. Yes. And that would be my fault. I apologize, everyone. There's a button that hits share your screen, and I did not click that button.
All right.
I was just so excited to get started. Okay, so let's back up a little bit here. So this is the Twitter demo I was just mentioning, and here on mvc.devexpress.com demos, the two tabs up here, this is the demo tab and the code tab. When you hit the code tab, you can take a look at all the code behind for each of the demos. Now these demos are kind of specific to features, right? They're not necessarily how you would build an application, but we're trying to show off features. So in today's webinar, I'm going to cover a little bit about how to create a new project using our template, and perhaps maybe a couple of good practices and so forth, right? So and the reason I say that is because there's a lot of features that we're showing off here. For example, data binding, sorting, editing, filtering. And if you took a look at the controller, you might think, wow, there's a lot of things going on in this controller, right? For example, what is this sorting partial and sorting, and what's grouping and so forth, right? And the reason why we don't separate these out into each controller is because then you'd have a lot of controllers versus one controller. So this was a design decision we made, because all of the code that you see here is also available locally on your machine. So if you launch the demo center, let me just show you that real quick. We've installed this in your local IIS Express so that you can I shouldn't say IIS Express, it's just been released, so many of you probably still have the old Cassini-based one. But here, if you click on ASP and click on MVC Extensions, you can launch the MVC Extensions demo. And this is the local version running on your in your local Cassini-based server. So here's the localhost some random port and MVC demos. And if you ever wanted to find the code for these, you can go into your users, public documents, and you'll see the DevExpress 2010.2 demos. And under components, ASP.NET MVC, you will see this project, and you can simply open the solution and have at it. So, for example, I was just mentioning the grid view. So if you take a look at controllers and the grid view controller, this controller is the same as what you're looking at here. And so, as I was mentioning, if we had separated into each controller, you'd have a ton of controllers here for each of the different features. So it just made sense for this demo as a design decision. But it is important to kind of reference this if you're ever trying to figure out, well, how do I do something, right? So for example, this data binding, we know it gets the tweets. So here, we've got a method here that says get DevExpress tweet. So you can always take a look at this and see, well, how's this done? And by the way, if this isn't big enough for you, I'd simply click this open a new pop-up window. Sorry about that. And DevExpress. And so here, we can see there's a method that returns an iList of tweet, which is an object we've created. And it says, okay, for these accounts, find me the latest tweets. And we grab those from the Twitter stream and return them. And it shows that basically once you grabbed it from that call using the search API, we simply return that iList and it data binds to the grid view. So let's take a look at a couple of the other features that I mentioned that are right out of the box with the grid view. As I mentioned, this is an overview, but I'm going to jump into Visual Studio real quick here. So I'm assuming that maybe someone has not seen some of these features, so let's cover them. Sorting is set out of the box. Now, if you're not familiar with the grid view sorting, it's got a very nice feature because it allows you to easily sort any of the options. Now, sorting is enabled by default, and I'll show you that in just a second when we create a project. So when I click the company name column, as I just did, you'll see that it automatically sorts. And if I click it again, it sorts in the other direction. Now, you can disable this by setting the settings behavior allow sort option to false. Now, we can also sort on multiple columns. So if I hold down the shift button here, you can see that I'm sorting by company name and contact name. Now, if I wanted to remove that, I can just click another column or simply the same column again to sort by it. So sorting is enabled out of the box. It's a wonderful feature and allows you to do it on multiple columns. Grouping is not enabled out of the box. However, it's very easy to enable. All you have to do is set the allow settings behavior allow group property to true and set the visibility of the show group panel. So if we take a quick look at here, before I talk about the actual feature of the grouping, let's just see how do you enable that. If we take a look at the view partial where this grid view is declared, and don't worry, I'll talk about how to declare this. Here we can see that we're setting the show group panel to true, and actually we don't even need to set the settings allow group to true. Once you set the show group panel to true, then we automatically have that capability to do grouping. So this is the group panel here, and here when we first launch it here, we've set a default, and by the way, you can do that, right? So by default, when you say show group panel, this is displayed, and we can have a default column that we always group by when the grid is first displayed. But if we don't, you can simply drag any of the columns up here. So for example, if we want to group by country, we'll drag country up there. We can also sort by the grouped column. So here we're sorting by the last country first. And we can also sort by multiple, we can also group by multiple columns. So here we were grouping by Argentina, but we'll also group by, let's say, region. And as you can see, it's a drag and drop operation all done for you. And all you simply have to do is set the show group panel property true. And you still have the capability to say which of the columns are grouped first. Now, some people have asked, is it possible to expand all rows or collapse all rows? And we've added these buttons here to show you that it's simply a call. And if we take a look, you can see that in the view, yes, the controller. it's a call to expand all rows. Let me see if I can show this to you. Okay. So if you call the grid expand all, that will expand all the rows. All right. So now let's move on to editing. Now this is by far one of the best features that's built right into the MVC GridView. Generally, you're going to need to have a grid. You're going to come up with a scenario where you need to do some CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, and the grid gives you that to you by default. So when you provide your model to the grid view and you set the and you allow editing to true, you can do things like adding a row. Now, so when I hit the edit here, you'll see that it puts this row into the edit mode, and we can also create a new. Now, when I hit edit, what you saw it did there is it took you to a different view, and it shows and I shouldn't say necessarily different view, but it basically creates this for you. You don't have to create this text box, this drop down. The grid is smart enough to read the type of columns that we have and create this for us. And so when we hit update or cancel, once that operation is done, it takes us back and updates this grid view as well. Now this is a fantastic feature because, as I said, you don't have to build any of that yourself. And then we also have filtering. Now filtering is a very powerful feature because it puts the power of finding and sorting data into your end user's hands. So for example, here we were using the header filter, and it's very easy to enable. You just set the show header filter button to true. And once you do set it to true, your columns will have this nice little funnel looking filter button that when you click on it will grab the unique values from that column and allow you to pick and choose which one you want to sort by. So here you can say, show me only the blanks for the company name or anything that's not blank, or show me specifically where the company name equals around the horn. So now I've got this item, and now I, being the end user, can go further and say, well, let me do a specific country for this company name. Well, around the horn is only based in the UK, so let's see if we can't pick a different quantity instead, because we'll have some different values. And it's also smart enough to understand that because there's a lot of range values in quantity, it gives you ranges to sort by. So for example, here, we're going to sort and find everything between 20 to 25. Now, that's just one of the filtering options. We also have the option to do a filter row, which allows your end users to do free-form typing. So here, we can still choose a specific type of filtering in the filter row. So for example, in the product name, I'm going to find anything that not begins with, but perhaps contains a certain text that I put in here. So I didn't actually enter any characters yet, but let's say I want to find this seed, this aniseed syrup. So I'll type in the word seed and give it a second, and the callback kicks in, and it finds that everything that has the word seed within it. Now, to clear that filter, I can simply hit clear, or I can do further refinement of that filtering. Now, we also have the option to do focus row. So let me bring up focus row. Now, as I said, I'm simply going to mention some of these, and then we'll dive right in and create a new project with the grid view. By the way, Amanda, if there's any questions, let me know. I think, hang on one second. I've got a problem with my local VPN here and conflicting with the thing. All right, so let's do this. While that's loading up, let me start the new project, okay? So to do this, in Visual Studio 2010, click the New Project or File, New Project. And if you have DevExpress DXperience version 2010.2 or higher installed, you will find the DevExpress ASP.MVC2 web application project template. Now, I should mention that in a future release, we've already announced our support for ASP.MVC3. Now, in this webinar, I'm only going to cover the MVC2 stuff, but in a future webinar, I'll be covering MVC3, the Razor View Engine, and the upcoming project templates that we have for it. So, for example, this project template is for MVC2 only, but we have MVC3 based project templates coming as well. So this project template, by selecting it, allows you to quickly get started. And what it does is add things like references and so forth. So let's just give it a name like webinar grid demo. Now, for the purposes of this demo, I'm not going to use a unit test project. And as you can see, what it's doing is Visual Studio gets kicked in, and it creates the default things like a home controller, a default model, and this is kind of very much based on the Microsoft project template that creates a default ASP.MVC website for you. However, this has been specifically set up for DevExpress project templates, and the reason is you need to add certain things like references, configuration sections in the web config, and we take care of all that for you. So you don't have to worry, well, do I have the proper references and assemblies, et cetera, et cetera. It's done for you. And one of the key things being is we add in the site master page the style sheets as well as the scripts that are necessary for you to use this. So any page that derives off this site master can add a DevExpress MVC extension. So the very first thing I like to do whenever you create a new project is compile it and run it, just to make sure everything's working right. So I'm going to hit Control F5, which is running without debugging, and let it launch. So we can see that we didn't get any compilation errors, and here's our default site. And you can see it's very much like the Microsoft project template. However, we've got this nice little message, and we can get started right away to add an extension here. Instead, I think what I want to do, instead of adding it to home or about, I want to add it to a new page. So let's first do that. Let's go into Site Master and just add a new item, and just to show you how easy it is to add a new link up here. So to add another link, we can simply add here. Now, if you're not sure what this method takes, not in one of the actual parameters of the method, but right after the open call, you can hit Control-Shift-Space and get the item. So here, we know it takes a link text, which is what the name of the link should be on the URL, the action name that it gets that it's going to bind to, and the controller it goes to. So let's see. Yes. Well, when we say route values, meaning that what controller has those route values where we're going to look for this action. So let's call this something like DevExpress grid, and we'll call this simply grid, and we'll use the home controller as well. So let's save that. Take a quick look. Now, we can see here we have our new menu item that when I hit doesn't actually go anywhere, and that's because we haven't defined the action yet in the controller. So let's do that. So I'm going to go into the controllers here, and in the home controller we should define a new action. So let's call this public action result grid, which is what I call the action, and I'm going to return a view. Okay, so now we'll get a blank page. That's fine, that's enough. However, what we want to do is actually we want to add a view. Now, as I said, that action we don't want it to add it to the index page, so we're going to need to create a new view. Now, before I jump into how to create this view and how we need to set it up, we're going to first need some data. If we take a look at the models folder, there is simply the default account model. This is the login information. Now, that's not what I want to use. So what I want to do is I want to add a new item. So I'll right-click on model and I create a new item. And under the data, I'll select a link to SQL class. And I'll call this something like movies. Now, just to show you real quick, if you have DevExpress 10.2 installed, we released this sample application. It's called, I believe it's under WinForms or under Tools. I forget where it is specifically, but it's called the DX Video Rental app. And when you install DevExpress 10.2 in your local SQL Express installation, it adds a video rental database. So I'm going to use that, and you're free to use that as well. So while that link to SQL Designer launches, let me close this and show you my desktop icons. So here it is. So this is the DevExpress video rental application. This isn't really about that, and we're going to have some videos about this in the future. But what I simply wanted to mention is that the database for this rental app is available. So now that it's created a link to SQL class, it gives us the designer as well. And we don't actually have any entities on our designer. So what I'm going to hit Server Explorer. And right now I've got one connection to a server mode grid project. Now this too is created from our demos, and this is used whenever we're displaying our large demos, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So I want a new connection, so I'm going to click Add Connection, and in my local database I'm going to hit /SQL Express, since I'm using SQL Express, and I'll take a look, and here is the video rent database I was just mentioning. Do a quick test, hit OK. And once I've created this connection, you can take a look at some of the tables. Now here you can see there's a lot of tables going on here. So I'm going to pick the movie table, bring that in, and I can see I've got a ton of things in here. So I may or may not want all those items, so I can here trim some of these items. So let's take a look and keep something like, let's get rid of, we'll display category, well, we'll display title, tagline, plot, and awards, and get rid of things like the rest. Might be just too much information. So now let's hit save and display this information in a grid view. So the first thing we want to do, now that we actually have some data, is we want to create a new view. And what you can do, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can go to your views, and in the home, right-click and add a new view, or there's a facility, and CodeRush helps you with this as well, but there's a facility in ASP.MVC that you can right-click on this action and click Add View. Now this brings up the new Add View dialog, and here we can make a strongly typed view, and if we don't, it'll create a dynamic view, and I'll talk about it in just a second. What I want to do is I'm going to leave this and I'll call it grid, the same as this action. And I'm only going to have it based off the site master, but I didn't make a strongly typed view. Now, here I can make a call to the GridView extension, but you don't want to do this. And the reason is the grid view should always be declared in a partial page, and I'll explain that in just a second. So instead here, we would make a call. So for now, I'm simply going to say call GridView partial as a reminder for myself. And now let's go make a actual partial page. So what we can do here is I can go ahead and create a new partial page by clicking a new item and going to Web, MVC2 View User Control, and give it a name. Now I can do that and it would add that, but I'm also going to show you a slightly different way to do this. So if you click, if you create the action, because we know we're going to need an action as well, then we can base it off the same way by doing that add view. So here I'm going to create another action. Now, you know what? I'm going to do sort of the lazy approach because I am a cut, copy, paste master. So I'm going to copy that, and I know the only thing different is the name. So here, this action partial. This grid partial is what I'm going to be calling from my partial page. So now I can right-click on this and go back to the add view, and now I can create a partial page from here. Now here, I'll say here, I want it to be a partial view. I don't want to strongly type, and I'm going to click add. Now, here is where we're going to create our GridView extension. So, one of the first things, well, there's an error on this page, and I'm going to leave it just so that you can kind of see, because most likely what I just showed you could cause an error, so I want you to be aware of it. So the first thing is we'll start our tags and we'll create our grid. So we've extended in the ASP.NET HTML helper class, the HTML helper class. So you can go HTML.DevExpress and call any of our extensions. So here you can see all of the DevExpress MVC extensions. However, I simply want the grid view. So writing, and we'll start setting up its settings. Now, there's a couple of different ways in the MVC syntax how you can do this. For myself, I prefer doing it this way. However, you can actually create that settings object and then define its properties. It's actually a very similar thing. So for now, we'll call this, we'll set up all the settings here. So the first thing we want to do is give it a name. Now here, I'm simply going to call this GV Grid Demo. And then the second thing I'm going to do is set its callback route values. Now this thing, as it says, it defines the routing logic, specifying the names of the controller and action which should handle callbacks. What that basically means is I'm going to tell the grid where to go when a callback occurs. And this is important because all the great Ajax-y things that you see, meaning that the non-full page postback items that the grid does, is based on callbacks. And that was a design philosophy we had when we created the grid view. And it works fantastic because you don't have to do anything yourself. So we simply need to define a couple of things with callback route values. And the first thing is we tell it what controller we're going to be using. And since I've already defined that action here, grid partial, I'm going to say it's based out of the home controller. So I'm going to say the controller is home, and the action is that method I just created, which is called grid partial. Oops. And that's it. And now we can do a couple of other things like set up the filter row or the group panel. So let's do that. Let's add a filter row and a group panel. So we'll say settings dot show filter row, and I'll set that to true, and do the copy paste thing, and I'll show the group panel. There we go. All right, so that's enough for us right now to actually display the grid. So let me stop right there and close this, and now we need to call the bind method, and we'll pass it the model, and finally we'll call the render, which will render the grid. Now, we have our grid partial set up. However, we need to be able to call it actually from this page. And the reason is, when I say page, view. This view is empty right now. Sure, the grid partial exists, but if we don't make a call to the grid partial, then we'll never see it. So what we want to do is actually call it, and there's a very simple call we can make. We'll simply say html.renderPartial, and we'll call it the name of the grid that we need. So we'll say grid partial, and we need to send in some data. We'll call model. So now we have everything we just about need to display it, right? So when we hit this grid page, the home controller is going to say, okay, go ahead and display the view. However, when it gets here, it's expecting some data, and we're not passing any data. So let's actually grab some data and pass it from our model. So to do that, we can do it in a number of different ways. So the first thing we want to do, one second. The first thing I would recommend doing is creating a separate method. Now, as you saw, we had that get DevExpress tweak method, so I'm going to create a get movies method. So I'm going to actually call public, create a new method called public, and the grid, if you're not aware, will take a IEnumerable. So I'm going to call this IEnumerable. I'm going to return an IEnumerable, I should say, from this method, and say call it get movies. Now, to use the models, well, first of all, I got a little problem here. It's not recognizing this, so we'll simply add that using system collections call, and now the .NET will recognize this. Now, I also want to make another using call, and that's to the actual models. So I'm going to call this the webinar.models namespace, and now I can reference anything in that models namespace. So I can do a simple call like return and get the items, and just write something like here, like from movies in here I'll actually need to make a call to the data context. So this can be a little unusual. So let me restart that again. The first thing we need to do is get a reference to our data context, right? And to do that, I can simply call this the movies data context, and I'll call this MVC or something like that. It's equal to a new movies data context. And now I can write my link statement, which says link return from movies in movies MVC dot movies select movies. Now, what's interesting about writing link, and you don't have to, right? So for example, if I was just going to get all the items from the movies, I don't really need to write a link statement. But what's interesting is if you do write a link statement, you can do certain things like, get only, like, say, the top 10 items or something like that, so you can do something like this. However, my suggestion is if you're going to grab all the data, I wouldn't bother writing in that perspective, right? There's an easier way to do this, right? So instead of creating a data context and then writing some link, you can simply say something like return new, and here we're going to call the movies data context, and simply call the table movies. And this will give us all the data from that entity that we're referencing. And it's just a little bit easier. Unless you have a specific reason to do this, I recommend just going with something a little bit simpler like this. Now, after we display some of this data, I'm going to show you how to make this a little bit better too, in terms of sort of a best practice, in terms of refactoring and putting this into its own class in its own repository. Anyways, so now we have this get movies, and we can pass it directly inside of the call. So now, when we say return view, I actually want to say get me those items. So here I'm going to say get movies, and this will give it the IEnumerable and the data it requires. Now I know I also need it for the grid partial, so I'll call this get movies. Now let's take a look at this in action. So while that's loading up, I can talk a little bit about sort of that repository thing I was mentioning. By the way, here's that video rental app. It's very slick, and we'll have some videos on it in the future. In general, it's not always a great idea to do some of this stuff inside of the controller, and that's why I mentioned that we can refactor that easily. So now we can see we have our grid, and if I click on it and we go to it, I see that, oh, I got this problem. And it's this weird problem that says 19 CS 1973 helper dynamic has no method name render partial, etc., etc., etc. And if you remember, I kind of mentioned that we were going to have this problem, and the reason is when we created this grid partial, it wanted to, because I didn't give it a strongly typed thing, it created this default dynamic, and the best way to do this is just to remove that dynamic, right? Now, if you don't use that dialog and just right click from the home and create this based on the file new item dialog, you may not get that dynamic. However, if you ever have these unusual problems, that weird error, my recommendation is to make sure that it inherits directly just from the view user control. Now let's save this and take a look at it in action again. Now when I click the DevExpress grid, oh, okay, I still have a problem, and I believe it's because in the grid ASPX I'm probably inheriting from dynamic as well. So let's remove that and take a look at it in action again. Now when I hit DevExpress grid, I can see that it got the fields that I'm displaying. However, and it's fantastic because, as I said, I've got my group panel, I can do sorting, I can do paging. However, some of the columns don't look right. And I actually don't even want some of the columns like OID, move ID. Really, I just want, let's say, the last four ones like title, tagline, and plot, and the words. So let's do that. Let's define and get rid of some of these columns that we don't want. So the easiest way is to simply define a column in the grid partial, meaning that if I go here and start adding some columns, the grid view has an internal logic that says as soon as it sees you started to define your own columns, it's not going to auto-generate those columns. So now, because I'm going to do settings.columns.add, and I'll say something like, give me the title, and I'm going to show, oops, let's say title, and one more column. All right, so this is where cut and paste can be dangerous. So be sure you use it, very wisely, because you don't want to have two columns with the same names or something like that. So anyways, now I'll create the 4 columns that I want to display, which is title, tagline, plot, and awards. And if you're not sure, just simply reference and make sure title, tagline, plot, and awards. Yes, those are the 4 that I want to display. So now let's take a look at this in action. And we'll hit the grid. And that's much cleaner now. But if you remember, I also had another column category, but it didn't display the right information. So let's first do that. Let's first display the category, and just so you get an idea of why it won't display properly. I believe it was just called category. Let's just make sure. Yes, category. And let's take a look at this in action. So now, when we see this, yes, category gives us this weird ID. But let's actually grab that information. And this is a good way to show off how you can add a custom column like a combo box. So for example, if you take a look at one of our, I believe it's editing. Actually, a category here can show us as well. So let's go back to filter row. And you will see in the code behind that the category is referenced from a different table, and that's kind of exactly what we want to do. And to do that, we need to all lookup fields usually need a separate source of data because we're looking it up in a different table or a different entity and so forth, right? And if we take a look at our view parcel here, you can see that's exactly what's happening here, right? For example, we're not only adding a new column, but we're also defining its properties and saying, well, this is where you're actually going to do the lookup and get the data. So let's see how we can do that with ours. The first thing I want to do is actually make sure I have that data. So let's go back to our movies DB, go back to the Server Explorer, and take a look at the tables. So here we had movie, but we also have a movie category. So let's bring movie category in because I'm pretty sure, yes. Now you can see it automatically made that link and it says yes. The movie category using OID actually has a name. So I want to display the name, but I want to reference the OID to get that name, to make sure per row it's displaying the right information. So let's first save this. Now anytime you make a change to your linked SQL model, always a good idea to change it. Always a good idea to compile it and just make sure it's working right. Now let's go back to our grid partial and set up this column. So the first thing I want to do is actually grab the column here. Now, we're simply making a settings columns add here, but it also returns an object. Now, generally, we don't need to grab this object, but in cases like this, it is a good idea to grab it because we're going to do something with it. So I'm going to create a variable called var column to get that and change how this is actually declared. So instead of just saying settings add category, we're going to use one of its other overrides. And let's see, I believe it is the one that allows us to define the column type as well as the caption. So here, if we had something like category ID, then we can define a different caption. So just to show you, I'll call this the same caption name category, and we'll give it the column type. Now here, we can see it gives us the already IntelliSense already tells us this is a MVC GridView column type. I'll select that, and if I hit the period, you can see that here's all the different column types we can create. So I'm going to select combo box. Now we're going to grab that column, and I'm going to create another variable here to grab the properties. Just call this combo box. Now I'm going to copy that since I'll be using that again, and I'll be referencing the column dot properties edit, and I'm going to typecast it and make sure this is set as a combo box properties type. Now I can set up the combo box properties such as its data source. Now in MVC there's no such thing really as a data source, but this property simply lets us tell it where to grab the data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the data from this movies category. To do that, I'm going to say this is set to new, and I'm going to set it to new, and I'll call the webinar demo.models. Movie category table. And finally, we want to set up a couple of other items. Oops, and make sure we add these parentheses too, since we're grabbing all the items in the movie category. And now we're going to need to set a couple of this combo box specific properties, like its text field. This is the field that it displays when it hooks up. So I know in the other table, in the movie category table, it's called name, and the value field is called OID. And I also want to set the value field type. I'll simply call this type of int, because I know it's an integer, simply by taking a look here. By the way, if you're not sure, there's a simple way to check, and that's by going to the moviesdesigner.cs file and take a look at OID. Yes, so here the OID is actually a type of GUID which has a bunch of numbers that we saw before. So now let's take a look at this in action and see if we're able to show off our property information. Now we'll go to the DevExpress grid. Oops, okay. So here we got a problem. It says the data source is an invalid type. So it's expecting a iList source, iNumerable, or iData source. So let's go ahead and fix that. So right here, it does not like the information that I'm passing here. And that's because what I needed to do is I'm trying to grab just the movie categories directly. Now what I need to do is actually give it a data context first. So I needed to create a new movie data context first before I can grab the movie categories directly. So let's take a look at this. But you know, before I go over this further, while this isn't a bad idea, if you take a look at our online demos, you can see that we don't actually do this. And we have a slightly different approach, which says, hey, in my controller, I have a get categories. So get the categories from my controller. So in here, if I take a look, get categories, it simply says, give me everything that in this database, which is simply a data context call, give me the categories from that table. And in this call, we're simply saying, okay, get the view context, which is the current view that we're in, and get its controller, typecast it to the type of controller where this is called, and this is the GridView controller, and make a call to get categories. So in my case, I did it a slightly different way. So let me show how this can be sort of done through the home controller approach. Well, I think this is a good time to show you that refactoring I was talking about as a best practice. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's not a great idea to do this inside of the actual home controller. Instead, some of the best practices says that you should probably create a whole other class. So if you go and create in your models a new class, we're going to call this, let's call this movies repository. Now here, I'm going to move those calls from the other table. So let's take this out of here altogether, which means we'll be changing these calls because now it doesn't know how to reference those. and I'll put it in here. However, you can see that I'm dynamically creating this movie context, but I think I want to be a little bit more explicit. And now that I have this repository, I can do something like create and make sure that it's used when this repository is created. So I'm going to create a local variable. I'll call this MVC here, and I'm going to make sure I'm going to create another method here that just does a get, and if that data context exists, it will return it. If it doesn't, we're simply going to create it and return it. So I'm going to once again call this movies data context. I'll call this movies DB, and now we'll do a get, and I'll call this if this MVC is equal to null, then we're going to create it. New movies data context, and then we're simply going to return MVC. Now this effectively says, hey, if it's null, go ahead and create it. If not, just go ahead and return it either way. Let's close this call, and now I can use movies DB instead of creating this on the fly. Now, the reason this is useful is if you ever have multiple calls. Right now we only have get movies, so we might have been okay with just enough. But typically you're going to have more than one method. You might be getting things like categories and so forth. Let me go ahead and fix this. Make sure you're referencing the using system collections. And by the way, we didn't need to make a call to the webinar models because we're already in that namespace, which is why we can reference that data context. So now let's go ahead and fix this code here, which says that it's trying to get movies. However, those movies are now in a different repository. So we have to call that repository directly. And the way to do that, first let's remove this call. First thing we want to do is create that repository. And before we can do that, let's first compile this so that we can reference it. And get movies that doesn't exist in this column, that's right. Okay, now we're going to create a new call to movies repository. IntelliSense is not giving us the repository. There it is. And now we can make a call to get movies. Now, you might think, well, what do we really do here? All we did was we moved it to a separate repository, right? And the reason why this is important is because this is another paradigm of the ASP.NET framework, which is separation of concerns. And this is why it's useful to make sure that we don't necessarily are doing a lot of data intensive stuff in the controller, and we try to separate it out into the proper area, which would be the models area. So we are making this movies repository responsible for getting this information. And this is also helpful when you're doing testing and so forth. So let's first make sure that what we did here is at least going to work for us. And to make sure, I'm going to first comment this section out. And let's just make sure our repository is working the way we're expecting it to, and then I'll show you how to bind up that category. So now let's go back to the grid, and it's working just as we expected before. And now let's go ahead and add this information back. However, we know that this data source is not how optimal in terms of how we want to do it. So one thing I want to do is I know I want to get the category. So let's first let's just grab that information the same way we're getting the movie. So I'm going to make another method here, and I'll call this get categories. Public enumerable, and call this get categories. And here I'll use some link. Instead of, I can do it the same way here as movies DB and just call it movies category again, or I can do something like from category in movies DB dot movie categories, and I'm going to select the category. There. Now we have everything we need. Let's make sure it compiles. And now we can go back and make the call and get that information. Now, I'm going to do a little different here. And the first thing I want to do here is I'll create a call to the models and create that movies repository class. I'm sorry, object. And then I can make a call to get categories directly. Now, let's take a look at this in action. Now, when we go to the DevExpress grid, we see how we are referencing category, and we're getting the proper categories for our movies. Now, I want to show one other thing, which is data binding to a large database for the MVC GridView. You can see a demo of it online here, and it's very similar in terms of how we're creating this thing. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker, so if there's any questions, feel free to ask. The only reason I'm doing this is because I know I'm hitting the hour mark, and if you guys are pressed for time, let me know, but I'd really like to show this to you. So let's just dive right in. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to need a couple of similar types of calls here. So what I'm going to do is start with the actual action, and I'll call this large grid. And here I'm simply going to return the view. Now these are going to be slightly different than how we did this thing. And here we're passing a model, but as you'll see that we don't really need this model to be passed in for the large grid. So I'll call this large grid and large grid partial. View. And as you see, in theory, I probably don't even need to have a secondary action because these two kind of do the same thing. And the reason I started with the action here is just so I can do the dialog with the add view. First thing I'm going to do is just create a new, well, okay, so let me back up here. I should say, how do I put this? If I create a new view, then I'm going to need to either add a new item. But let's do this. What if we add a secondary grid to that view here? Well, we're still going to need a partial. And the reason I want to show this approach is because somebody was asking this, how do you have multiple data sources and so forth? Well, because the grid view is always in a partial, you just create a new partial. So let's do this. Let's add it to this grid here. Now, first, I know I'm going to make a new partial, so I'm going to call this large grid partial, even though I haven't created it yet. And I'm not going to pass a model, and I'll explain that in just a second. So now, when this grid renders, it's going to render the regular grid we had and the new grid that we're going to be showing as well. So going back to the home controller, I don't even need this because I'm not going to create a new view. I'm just going to create a partial. So here, I can right-click, add view, and just create a partial view. And now it'll go and create that partial view for us here. Now, remember I said that too when we want to take out this dynamic call. And here, I can do the same thing. Now, just because I'm a little bit pressed for time, I'm going to do a little similar cut, copy, and paste action here. So I'm just going to grab a few of these items here. And let's go back to our large grid partial. So here, all I'm saying is create a DevExpress grid view, give it a name like large grid demo, set its callback route values, and it's very important that we do have this right. So, you know, I'm probably doing a little bit of a disservice, but, you know, I'm a little bit, how do I say this? Just be very careful, as I mentioned before, when you do cut, copy, and paste, because you could very easily leave it to some different action name, and you'll be like, why am I not getting the right data? So just be sure that we double check all of our values. So we know the home controller is where this large grid partial action lives. I do want to show the filter row in the group panel, and now we want to look at the actual binding. Now this is where we want to first figure out what are we going to bind to. So I can bind back to the movies database. However, I think I want to add a whole another model. So let me do that. So I'm going to right click and add a new link to SQL model. And let's go to data and let's say link to SQL. And I'll just call this something like server data large. So, okay, we'll call it large server data for now. you probably want to be a little bit more direct in terms of what that data is. So let's just say, for example, I know this email data, so I'll call this emails. And we'll click add. So now when I go to the Server Explorer, I can grab a table that we already have in here. However, I want to use a different one. As I mentioned before, when you install our 10.2 demos, another one of the tables it creates, a database it creates, is the server mode grid projects. And we use this database, which has a bunch of test data, to show you how to data bind to large sets of data. So I think this has like 300,000 records in it. So I'll drag and drop it on here. And I'll leave these fields in here only because I know I'm going to create some custom fields for, let's say, subject, from, sent, and size. So I'll save this. As I mentioned, whenever you create a link to SQL or change it, always recompile. All right, now we'll go back to the large grid partial, and I can reference the binding action. So to bind to a large grid, we're not going to use the bind method, regular bind method, which requires a model. We're going to do a bind to link. Now, this bind to link will allow us to bind directly to the data context. Now, what I'm going to show you is going to get improved because we weren't super happy with it. But what we need is a data context. So what I usually do is, first I just grab the data context. And the way to do that, you can just reference your model, which is in your webinar emails data context. So I'm going to cut that, copy that, and put it as the first string value, comma. And as you can see, that's the context type name is the first value, and the table name is the second thing. And to grab the table name, I'm also going to go back to the designer. So here, let's go back to our Solution Explorer and just make sure, because what Link to SQL does, it might change the values. So I will create, I will reference the designer.cs file under emails, and I'm going to do a search for table. So we know that we have one table in this link to SQL model, and that's the server-side grid test. Now, if you notice, this is actually a little bit different than server-side grid test. So this is why I say it's important to make sure that we got the right name. So I'll copy this, go back here, and pass it as value. So as I mentioned, we're going to make this a little bit better in a future minor release so that you have an easier way to find it. And I don't need a semicolon there because I still need to call the render action. Now, the reason why we don't pass a model is in the bind to link, what we're doing is we're essentially saying, hey, GridView, use your smart logic with the link to server mode data source approach and send that work back to the database, which is why we don't need that model. Well, we need the model, but we don't need to have it specifically defined for us. So let's just take a look at this in action. So if we did everything right, we should see two grids. One that's data bound to one partial, and the second that's data bound to the large database. So here, which is our first grid, going to the movies database, and this is a large one. So here, this one actually is bound to a 100,000 record database. So I have 10,000 pages with 10 rows per page, giving us 100,000 items. And as you can see, if I jump around to any page, it literally takes 1 or 2 seconds, even on my slow SQL Express database. And we still have the great searching capabilities, and we have the group panels and so forth. And as I mentioned, if you don't want to show all the fields, let's say we just want to show things like subject, from, sent, we simply define the columns.add property as we did before. Now, I'm going to stop here because I'm already hit the hour mark, and I want to allow for questions. So, Amanda, do we have any questions about what I've covered so far?
We don't have any questions thus far. So if you've got any questions out there, get them in now.
Okay, excellent. So while we're in for questions, what I'll do is also show off a couple of resources. The first thing, and I always mention this, right, is search.devexpress.com. This is like my best friend, and when people ask a question, I actually hit this first. And the reason is there is so much information out there, so many examples, so many codes, and we have a lot of properties for a reason. You know, the search, the support center is great for reporting issues, but a lot of times there will be great examples there. The forums are great for just peer-to-peer conversations. We have a knowledge base with articles on how-tos of doing something. Then there's documentation. There's a TV Central. Then there's Code Central. So there's a lot of places to go. So I always recommend hit search.devexpress, select technology to ASP.NET, set it to MVC extensions. And if you're looking for something like, you know, how do I do like focused row, just type it in here into the keywords, and it will go and search all these properties for you and give you all the great result set. And so you might even find, okay, well, maybe there's needs to be a suggestion here. So let's see, has this suggestion already been implemented or not, or is it coming in the future? You can just open up that open up that link and just take a look. And while that's opening up, you can see that it'll reference everything from, you know, let's say my blog to other user questions and even forum items. So here we can see that there's been a suggestion and it's already been implemented. And to implement it yourself, you simply need to call the settings behavior allow focus row to true. Then we also have the DevExpress forums. So if we go to devexpress.com, click on forums up at the top. By the way, I'm excited to say that the MVC extensions are really taking off. So in here, we'll find, you know, Roman, who's one of our lead MVC developers. Actually, he's one of the ASP.NET leads. Fantastic guy, very smart. He's there helping answer questions. I'm there. Other DevExpress customers and fans are there to help answer any questions. So I highly recommend just if you want to have peer-to-peer conversations. However, if you find a bug or have a suggestion, please use the DevExpress Support Center. To find that, just go to devexpress.com and go to /support. And here you can just go and create a new question and so forth. So if we click on Support Center, you'll get the links to create a suggestion, ask a question, and it's really easy. There's only a few questions. The very first thing might be, it'll ask you is, okay, what is your issue? And if it's an issue that it can't find a bug on, so you might say, you know, I found this CS 1973 bug with dynamic, right? And you can't figure it out. You know, you would first say, okay, well, let me see if it's been reported all, right? And this is why we put that searches, because generally, because we have tens of thousands of customers around the world, if you think there's an issue there, most likely it may have already been reported, solved, so you can just not even have worry about reporting it. So here, I can see it hasn't been reported at all. So I can go ahead and create this issue. So what other resources are out there as well? As I mentioned, blog is fantastic. So if you go to devexpress.com, cool. There's all sorts of posts that I'll have about, you know, webinars or MVC. If you want to do an MVC specific look up MVC specific post, you can simply go to this tags thing and click on ASP.MVC, and it'll bring up all the MVC related posts. As I mentioned, we've recently added the Vue Razor Engine support. And lastly, I do want to mention that these demos are really fantastic. If you have any questions about them, feel free to contact me, and you can contact me here, mharry@devexpress.com. So with that, I will stop, unless there's any questions, Amanda?
Nope, no questions. You were very thorough.
Excellent, excellent. I hope people enjoyed it. And in a future webinar, I'm going to do a couple of other interesting MVC scenarios. Somebody had asked something about cascading combo boxes. And this is similar to the, let me just show that feature real quick. This is similar to our GridViews cascading combo boxes, where if you have a country and a city, first you would select the country and you want to filter the second combo boxes to only show the pertaining countries within there. I believe it's under one of these demos. Let's see, grid rows. Unfortunately, I can't think of the actual demo it's under. It's under one of these. I can't remember which one. So anyways, oh, here we go, cascading combo boxes. Right. So in a future webinar, I will show you how to do this in ASP.MVC. So here I can select and say, give me all, set the country to USA. And now it's going to show me only cities pertaining to USA. And this is really useful because otherwise I'll show all sort of different cities, and your users may not have the proper context of which city they should pick. And as I said, we've got to support a Code Central demo of it, but I'll actually sort of walk you through it as well. And I'll also be showing off, probably even before cascading combo boxes, the MVC3 Razor view engine with DevExpress MVC, as well as our new MVC3 project templates. So keep an eye out for those upcoming webinars. I need to get them scheduled, but they are coming for sure. Okay, I'll put the links and blog posts about them on my blog as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mehul. All right, so quick peek into next week. If you have questions for us, we have 2 webinars for you. Monday, January 31st, it's an Ask DevExpress with the charting team, hosted by charting evangelist Brian Wood. A Q&A session with the charting team. It's your chance to ask questions or give feedback directly to us. And Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, it's another Ask DevExpress, but with reporting with a reporting evangelist Seth Juarez and the DevExpress reports team. And Tuesday at noon Pacific Standard Time, using CodeRush and WPF and Silverlight, Mark Miller and Rory Becker reveal how to accelerate your WPF and Silverlight development with CodeRush. So that's what's coming up. Just a quick peek into next week. Thank you so much, Mehul. Thanks to the team for being here as well. Again, if you missed anything from this webinar or you want to review previous webinars, visit us on the DevExpress channel at tv.devexpress.com, and to register for upcoming webinars, devexpress.com/webinars. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for choosing DevExpress.